To see a woman so suddenly after so much time alone made him very nervous, particularly since the woman was so out of temper. But as they drew closer, he found that, out of temper or not, he couldn't stop looking at her. Her eyes flashed as she lectured her daughters, neither of whom was taking the lecture silently. Both were trying to talk back, but the mother didn't pause to listen. She had abundant brown hair tucked into a bun at the back of her neck, though the bun had partly come loose. The old Mexican seemed not the least disturbed by the argument in progress. In fact, he seemed amused by it, and he rode up and got off his horse as if nothing were happening. "But she put a grasshopper down my neck," the younger girl said. "I hate her." "I don't care who hates who," the woman said. "I was up with this baby all night. You know how colicky he is. You don't have to scream right under my window. Looks like there'd be room on this prairie for you to scream without doing it under my window. All we got here is room." "It was a grasshopper," the little girl insisted. "Well, is it the first one you've ever seen?" the woman asked. "You'll have more to worry about than grasshoppers if you wake this baby again." The woman was rather thin, but anger put color in her cheeks. The girls finally were subdued, and the woman looked up and saw him, lifting her chin with a bit of belligerence, as though she might have to tie into him, too. Then she saw his discolored leg, and her look changed. She had gray eyes, and she turned them on him with sudden gravity. "Get down, senor," the old man said. The girls looked around and became aware for the first time that a stranger had come. They instantly stopped fidgeting and stood like statues. The woman smiled. She seemed to have switched from anger to amusement. "Hello, I'm Clara," she said. "Pardon the commotion. We're a loud bunch. Get down, sir. You're welcome." July had not spoken in so long, except for the few words he had said to Cholo and his ravings to Roscoe Brown, that his voice came out cracked. "Thank you. I wouldn't want to trouble you," he said. Clara laughed. "You don't look strong enough to trouble nobody around here," she said. "We grow our own troubles. It would be a novelty to have some we ain't already used to. These are my daughters, Sally and Betsy." July nodded to the girls and got off his horse. After a ride, his leg stiffened, and he had to hobble over to the porch. The baby was still fretting. The woman rocked it in her arms as she watched July hobble. "Snake bit him," Cholo observed. "I guess I rolled into it at night," July said. "I never even seen it. Just woke up with a yellow leg." "Well, if you've lived this long, I expect you have nothing to fear," Clara said. "We'll get some food in you. The way sick people have been turning up lately, I sometimes think we ought to go out of the horse business and open a hospital. Come on in the house. You girls set him a place." The old man helped him up the steps and into the roomy kitchen. Clara was poking the fire in the cook stove, the baby still held in one arm. "If you'd like a wash first, I'll have the girls draw some water," Clara said. "I didn't get your name." "I'm July Johnson," July said. "I come from Arkansas." Clara almost dropped the poker. The girls had told her the little scar-faced man had said the woman they were with was married to a sheriff named Johnson from Arkansas. She hadn't given the story much credence. The woman didn't strike her as the marrying type. Besides, the little man had whispered something to the effect that the big buffalo hunter considered himself married to her. The girls thought it mighty exciting, having a woman in the house who was married to two men, and if that wasn't complicated enough, the woman herself claimed to be married to D. Boot, the gunfighter they had hung last week. Cholo had been in town when the hanging took place, and reported that the hanging had gone smoothly. Clara looked more closely at the man standing in her kitchen. He was very thin and in a kind of daze, probably couldn't quite believe that he was still alive after such a journey. She had felt that way herself upon arriving in Oglala after her trip over the plains with Bob, and she hadn't been snake-bit or had any particular adventures. But if he was married to the woman, the baby drooling on her bosom might be his. Clara felt a flash of annoyance, most of it with herself. She had already grown attached to the baby. She liked to lie in bed with him and watch him try to work his tiny hands. He would peer at her for long stretches, frowning, as if trying to figure life out. But when Clara laughed at him and gave him her finger to hold, he would stop frowning and gurgle happily. Apart from the colic, he seemed to be a healthy baby. She knew the mother was probably still in Oglala, and that she ought to take the child into town and see if the woman had had a change of heart and wanted her son, but she kept putting it off. It would be discouraging to have to give him up. She told herself if the mother didn't want him bad enough to come and get him, then the mother was too foolish to have him. She reminded herself it was time she got out of the habit of babies. She wouldn't be likely to get any more, and she knew she ought to figure out another way to keep herself amused. But she did like babies. Few things were as likely to cheer her up. She had never seriously supposed a father would turn up, and yet only 3 weeks had passed, and one had, standing in her kitchen, dirty, tired, and with a badly discolored leg. Clara poked the fire a time or two more, trying to adjust to the surprise. Then she turned and looked at July. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "are you looking for your wife by any chance?" July almost fell over from surprise. "Yes, her name is Ellie. Elmira," he said. "How'd you ever know?" He began to tremble. Clara came over, took his arm, and led him to a chair. The girls were standing in the doorway, watching every move. "I've been looking for Ellie all the way," July said. "I didn't even know she come this way. She's not a large woman. I was afraid she might have died. Have you seen her?" "Yes," Clara said. "She stopped here for the night about 3 weeks ago in the company of 2 buffalo hunters." To July it seemed too much of a miracle that with the whole plains to cross, he and Ellie would strike the same house. The woman who was watching him intently seemed to read his mind. "We get a lot of travelers," she said, as though he hadn't spoken. "Situating this place right here was one of the smartest things my husband ever did. Anyone coming along the Platte who might need a horse isn't going to miss us. We're on the only road. If we hadn't located on this road, we'd have been starved out long ago." "It seems," July said, and he couldn't finish. It was all he had hoped for, to be able to find her someday. He had risked and lost 3 lives to do it, and though Ellie wasn't right there, surely she was in town. He began to tremble and then to cry. He couldn't help it. His hopes were to be answered after all. Silently, Clara handed him a rough dish towel. She scowled fiercely at the girls until they backed off. She followed them out the back door to give the man a moment to collect himself. "Why's he crying?" Betsy asked. "He's just unnerved. He's come along a long way, and I imagine he had stopped expecting to make it," Clara said. "But he's a man," Sally said. Their father had never cried, as far as she knew. "Men have tears in them, too, same as you," Clara said. "Go draw some water. I think we might offer him a bath." She went back in. July had not quite gained control of himself. He was too shaken with relief. The baby, now in a good mood, was mouthing its own fingers and rolling its eyes up to her. Might as well tell the man, she thought. She pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. "Mr. Johnson, I guess I've got another piece of news for you," Clara said. She looked from the baby's face to his, seeking resemblances. It seemed to her the foreheads were the same, and though the child had little hair, the little was the same color as July's. He was not a bad-looking man, just gaunt from his travels and dirty. She had a notion to make him shave when he had rested, so she could compare his face with the baby's. He could use Bob's razor. 1 week ago she had stropped it and shaved Bob. July looked at her as she fiddled with the baby. The tears had left him feeling empty, but his gratitude to the woman, just for being there and treating him kindly, was so great that he felt he might cry again if he tried to speak. The woman seemed too beautiful and too kind to be true. It was clear she was older. She had fine wrinkles around her mouth, but her skin was still soft, and her face, as she wiggled the baby's little hand with one finger, was very beautiful. The thought of more news troubled him a little, though. Probably one of Elmira's companions had stolen something or made some mischief. "If that woman was your wife, I guess this child is yours," Clara said. "She had it the night she was here. Then she left. She was very anxious to get to town. I don't believe she realized what a fine boy she had. We all took to him right away around this place." July had not really looked at the baby. He had supposed it belonged to Clara. She had said her name was Clara. She was watching him closely with her kind gray eyes, but what she said seemed so unlikely that he couldn't really credit it. Elmira had said nothing to him about wanting a baby or planning to have one or anything. To him, so tired he could hardly sit straight, it just meant another mystery. Maybe it explained why Elmira ran away, though it didn't to him. As for the little boy wiggling in Clara's lap, he didn't know what to think. The notion that he had a son was too big a notion. His mind wouldn't really approach it. The thought made him feel lost again, as he had felt out on the plains. Clara saw that he was past dealing with it for the moment. "I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson," she said, immediately getting up. "I should be cooking instead of worrying you with things you're too tired to deal with. You eat and go rest. This boy will still be here. We can discuss it tomorrow." July didn't answer, but he felt he was remiss. Not only was Clara going to a lot of trouble to feed him, she was taking care of a baby that might be his. He tried to think of things he might do or say, but nothing came to mind. Clara went cheerfully about the cooking, holding the baby in her arms most of the time, but occasionally plunking him on the table for a minute if she needed both hands for the work. "Just catch him if he starts to roll," she said. "That's all I ask." She fed July beefsteak and potatoes and peas. July felt he would be too tired to eat, and yet at the smell of the food his appetite returned, and he ate every bite. "I made Bob build me a windbreak," she said. "I watched my gardens blow away for 10 or 12 years, and I finally got tired of it." July looked at her questioningly. "Bob's my husband," she said. "He's injured. We don't hold out too much hope for him." She had strained and heated a little milk, and while July ate, she fed the baby using a big nipple she had fixed over a fruit jar. "We use this nipple for the colts," she said. "Sometimes the mares don't have their milk at first. It's a good thing this boy's got a big mouth." The child was sucking greedily on the nipple, which was quite large, it seemed to July. "I've been calling him Martin," Clara said. "Since he's yours, you may want to change it. I think Martin is a nice name for a man. A man named Martin could be a judge or maybe go into politics. My girls fancy the name, too." "I don't guess he's mine," July said. "Ellie never mentioned anything about it." Clara laughed. It surprised him. "Had you been married long?" she asked. "About 6 months," July said, "when she left." "Oh, well, you were newlyweds then," Clara said. "She might have been put out with you and decided not to tell you." "She had another boy, Joe," July said. "He went with me when I went after Jake Spoon, only Joe got killed on the plains. Ellie don't know it yet." "Did you say Jake Spoon?" Clara said. "I know Jake. We courted once. I saw him in Oglala about a year ago, but the woman he was with didn't like my looks, so we didn't talk much." "Why were you after Jake?" July could barely remember it all. It seemed to have happened so long ago. "Jake was gambling, and a fight got started," he said. "Jake shot off a buffalo gun, and the bullet went through the wall and killed my brother. I was out of town at the time. Peach, my sister-in-law, wanted me to go after Jake. I wish now I hadn't." "Sounds accidental to me," Clara said, "though I know that's no consolation to your family. Jake was no killer." "Well, I didn't catch him anyway," July said. "Elmira ran off, and Roscoe come and told me. Now Roscoe's dead, too. I don't guess it could be my baby." Clara was studying the two faces, the little one and the gaunt, tired one. It interested her, what came across from parent to child. "When did your wife run off?" she asked. "Oh, it's been over 4 months," July said. "A long time." Clara chuckled. "Mr. Johnson, I don't think arithmetic's your strong suit," she said. "I think this is young Mr. Johnson you're looking at. I had that figured out even without the dates, but the dates jibe pretty well." July didn't know what to say. Clara seemed delighted with her conclusion, but he didn't feel anything at all. It was just a puzzle. "I guess I'm awful," Clara said. "Any kind of company affects me this way. I shouldn't be bothering you when you're so tired. The girls are drawing water. You have a bath. You can sleep in their room. It's a good bed." Later, when he had bathed and fallen into a sleep so deep that he didn't even turn over for several hours, Clara brought the baby in and peeked at July. He hadn't shaved, but at least he had washed. Cleaned of dirt, he looked very young, only a few years older than her oldest boy would have been had he lived. Then she went to look at Bob for a moment. An ugly ooze had been seeping under his pillow. The stitches in his head had been removed, but underneath the wound seemed hot. It might be a new infection. Clara cleaned it as best she could and took the baby out on her little porch. "Well, Martin, your pa showed up," she said, grinning at the baby. "It's a good thing we got a house right on the road. I wonder what your pa will think of us when he gets his wits together." The baby waved a hand in the warm air. Down at the lots, the girls were watching Cholo work with a 2-year-old filly. Clara looked at the baby and offered it her finger. "We don't much care what your pa thinks of us, do we, Martin?" she said. "We already know what we think of him." Chapter 78. Lorena was sitting in her tent when Gus returned. She had been sitting there, hoping he wasn't dead. It was an unreasoning fear she had that Gus might die. He had only been gone 3 days, but it seemed longer to her. The cowboys didn't bother her, but she was uneasy anyway. Dish Boggett set up her tent at night and stayed close by, but it meant nothing to her. Gus was the only man she wanted to look after her. Then, before it was quite dark, she heard horses and looked out to see Gus riding toward her. She was so glad she wanted to run out to him, but Dish Boggett was nearby, trimming his horse's feet, so she kept still. "She's just fine, Gus," Dish said when Gus dismounted. "I looked after her as best I could." "I'm much obliged," Augustus said. "She won't hardly even look at me," Dish said. He said it mildly, but he didn't feel it mildly. Lorena's indifference pained him more than anything he had ever experienced. "Did you catch the horse thieves?" he asked. "We did, but not before they murdered Will Barger and 4 other people," Augustus said. "Hang 'em?" "Yes, hung them all, including Jake Spoon." "Well, I'll swear," Dish said, shocked. "I didn't like the man, but I never figured him for a killer." "He wasn't a killer," Augustus said. "Jake liked to joke and didn't like to work. I've got exactly the same failings. It's lucky I ain't been hung." He pulled the saddle off his tired horse. The horse lay down and had a good roll, scratching its sweaty back. "Howdy do, miss," Augustus said, opening the tent. "Give me a hug." Lorena did. It made her blush that he just asked like that. "If hugs are to be had for the asking, what about kisses?" Augustus asked. Lorena turned her face up. The feel of his whiskers made her want to cry, and she held him as tight as she could. "I wish we'd brought a bathtub on this trip," Augustus said, grinning. "I'm so dirty it's like kissing a groundhog." Later he went to the chuck wagon and brought back some supper. They ate outside the tent. In the distance the Irishman was singing. Gus told her about Jake, but Lorena felt little. Jake hadn't come to find her. For days she had hoped he would, but when he didn't, and her hope died, the memory of Jake died with it. When she listened to Gus talk about him, it was as if he were talking about a man she hadn't known. She had a stronger memory of Xavier Vance. Sometimes she dreamed of Xavier standing with his dish rag in the dry bean. She remembered how he had cried the morning she left, how he'd offered to take her to Galveston. But she didn't remember Jake particularly. He had faded into all the other men who had come and gone. He had got a thorn in his hand, she remembered that, but she didn't remember much else. She didn't much care that he was dead. He wasn't a good man, like Gus. What scared her was all the death. Now that she had found Gus, it was very frightening to her to think that he might die. She didn't want to be without him, yet that very night she dreamed that he had died and she couldn't find the body. When she came out of the dream and heard him breathing, she clung so tightly to him that he woke up. It was very hot, and her clinging made them sweaty. "What scared you?" Augustus asked. "I dreamed you died," Lorena said. "I'm sorry I woke you." Augustus sat up. "Don't fret," he said. "I need to go water the grass anyway." He went out, made water, and stood in the moonlight a while, cooling off. There was no breeze in the tent, so Lorena came out too. "It's a good thing this grass don't depend on me," Augustus said. "There's a lot more of it than I can get watered." They were on a plain of grass so huge that it was hard to imagine there was a world beyond it. The herd and themselves were like a dot surrounded by endless grass. Lorena had come to like the space. It was a relief after her years of being crowded in a little saloon. Gus was staring at the moon and scratching himself. "I keep thinking we'll see the mountains," he said. "I grew up in mountains, you know, Tennessee. I hear them Rockies are a lot higher than the Smokies. They say they have snow on top of them the year round, which you won't find in Tennessee." He sat down in the grass. "Let's sit out," he said. "We can nap in the morning. It will scandalize Call." "Why does he go off at night?" Lorena asked. "He goes off to be by himself," Augustus said. "Woodrow ain't a sociable man." Lorena remembered her other worry, the woman in Nebraska. "When will we get there, Gus?" she asked. "Nebraska, I mean." "I ain't sure," he said. "Nebraska's north of the Republican River, which we ain't come to yet. It might take us 3 weeks yet." Lorena felt a dread she couldn't get rid of. She might lose him to the woman. The strange trembling started. It was beyond her control. Gus put his arms around her to make it stop. "Well, it's natural to worry," he said. "This is a chancy life. What's the main thing that worries you?" "I'm feared you'll die," Lorena said. Augustus chuckled. "Darn right I'll die," he said. "What else worries you?" "I'm feared you'll marry that woman," she said. "I doubt it," Augustus said. "That woman had 2 or 3 chances to marry me already, and she didn't take them. She's an independent type, like you used to be." That was so, Lorena reflected. She had been quite independent, but now all she could think of was keeping Gus. She wasn't ashamed, though. He was worth keeping. "It's funny humans take to the daylight so," he said. "Lots of animals would rather work at night." Lorena wanted him to want her. She knew he did want her, but he had done nothing. She didn't care about it, but if she could be sure that he still wanted her, then the dread of losing him might go away. "Let's go in," she whispered, hoping he'd know what she meant. He immediately turned to her with a grin. My," he said, "times do change. I remember when I had to cheat at cards to get a poke. We don't have to go in that old hot tent. I'll drag the bedding out here." Lorena didn't care that the cowboys might see or who might see. Gus had become her only concern. The rest of the world could watch out. But Gus merely hugged her and gave her a kiss. Then he held her tight all night, and when the sun woke her, the herd was already gone. "Did anybody see us?" she asked. "If they did, they're lucky," Augustus said. "They won't get too many chances to see such beauties as us." He laughed and got up to make the coffee. Chapter 79. Newt couldn't get Jake out of his mind, how he had smiled at the end and given him his horse. He rode the horse every 3rd day and liked his gait so much that he soon became his favorite horse. Jake hadn't told him what the horse's name was, which worried Newt. A horse needed a name. Jake's hanging had happened so quickly that it was hard to remember. It was like a terrible dream, of the kind you can only remember parts of. He remembered the shock it had been to see Jake with his hands tied, sitting on his horse with a noose around his neck. He remembered how tired Jake looked, too tired even to care that he was going to be hung. Also, nobody talked much. There should have been some discussion, it seemed to Newt. Jake might have had a good excuse for being there, but nobody even asked him for it. Not only had no one talked at the hanging, no one had talked since either. Captain Call kept well to himself, riding far from the herd all day and sleeping apart at night. Mr. Gus stayed back with Lorena, only showing up at mealtimes. Dietz was very quiet when he was around, and he wasn't around much. He spent his days scouting far ahead of the herd, which was traveling easily. The Texas bull had assumed the lead position, passing Old Dog almost every day, and only giving up the lead to go snort around the tails of whatever cows interested him. He had lost none of his belligerence. Dish, who rode the point, had come to hate him even more than Needle Nelson did. "I don't know why we don't cut him," Dish said. "It's only a matter of time before he kills one of us." "If he kills me, he'll die with me," Needle said grimly. Of course, all the hands were curious about Jake. They asked endless questions. The fact that the farmers had been burned puzzled them. "Do you think they was trying to make people think Indians did it?" Jasper asked. "No, Dan Suggs just did it because he felt like it," P.I. said. "What's more, he hung 'em after they were already dead. Shot 'em, hung 'em, and then burned 'em." "He must have been a hard case, that Dan," Jasper said. "I seen him once. He had them little squint eyes." "I'm glad he never squinted them at me, if that's the way he behaves to white men," Needle said. "What was Jake doing with an outfit like that?" "If you ask my opinion, that horror that Gus has got was Jake's downfall," Bert Borum volunteered. "You can keep your damn opinion to yourself, if that's what you think," Dish said. He was as touchy as ever where Lorena was concerned. "Just because you're in love with a whore don't mean I can't express my opinion," Bert countered. "You can express it, and I can knock your darn teeth down your throat for you," Dish said. "Laurie didn't make Jake Spoon into no criminal." Bert had always considered that Dish had been awarded the top-hand position unfairly, and he was not about to put up with such insolence from him. He took his gun belt off, and Dish did the same. They squared off, but didn't immediately proceed to fisticuffs. Each walked cautiously around the other, watching for an opening. Their cautiousness provoked much jocularity in the onlookers. "Look at them priss around," Needle Nelson said. "I used to have a rooster I'd match against either one of them." "It'll be winter before they hit the first lick at this rate," Jasper said. Dish finally leaped at Bert, but instead of boxing, the two men grappled and were soon rolling on the ground, neither gaining much of an advantage. Call had seen the men square off, and he loped over. But when he got there, they were rolling on the ground, both red in the face, but doing one another no harm. He rode the hell-bitch right up to them, and when they saw him, they both stopped. He had it in his mind to dress them down, but the fact that the other hands were laughing at their ineffectual combat was probably all that was needed. Anyway, the men were natural rivals in ability and could be expected to puff up at some point. He turned and rode back out of camp without saying a word to them. When he saw him go, Newt's heart sank. The captain said less and less to him, or to anyone. Newt felt more and more of a need for somebody to talk about Jake. He had been the captain's friend and Mr. Gus's. It didn't seem right that he could be killed and buried and no more said. It was Dietz, finally, who understood and helped. Dietz was good at mending things, and one night as he was mending Newt's bridle, Newt said what was on his mind. "I wish we could at least have taken him to jail," Newt said. "They'd hang him, too," Dietz said. "I expect he'd rather us did it." "I wish we hadn't even come," Newt said. "It's just too many people dying. I didn't think we'd ever kill Jake. It wasn't like an accident. If he didn't kill anybody, then it wasn't fair," he added. "Well, there was the horses, too," Dietz said. "He only liked pacers," Newt said. "He wouldn't be bothered to steal horses as long as he had one to ride. Just being along didn't make him a horse thief." "It'd do to the captain," Dietz said. "It'd do to Mr. Gus." "They didn't even talk to him," Newt said bitterly. "They just hung him. They didn't even act like they were sorry." "They sorry," Dietz said. "Saying won't change it. He's gone. Don't worry about him. He's gone to the peaceful place." He put his hand for a moment on Newt's shoulder. "You need to rest your mind," he said. "Don't worry about the sleepers." How do you stop, Newt wondered. It wasn't a thing he could forget. P.I. mentioned it as he would mention the weather, something natural that just happened and was over. Only for Newt it wasn't over. Every day it would rise in his mind and stay there until something distracted him. Newt didn't know it, but Call, too, lived almost constantly with the thought of Jake Spoon. He felt half sick from thinking about it. He couldn't concentrate on the work at hand, and often, if spoken to, he wouldn't respond. He wanted somehow to move time backwards to a point where Jake could have been saved. Many times in his thoughts he managed to save Jake, usually by having made him stay with the herd. As the herd approached the Republican, Call's thoughts were back on the Brazos, where Jake had been allowed to go astray. At night, alone, he grew bitter at himself for indulging in such pointless thoughts. It was like the business with Maggie that Gus harped on so. His mind tried to change it, have it different, but those too were pointless thoughts. Things thought and things said didn't make much difference, and with Gus spending all his time with the woman, there was very little said anyway. Sometimes Gus would come over and ride with him for a few miles, but they didn't discuss Jake Spoon. As such things went, it had been simple. He could remember hangings that had been harder. Once they had to hang a boy for something his father had made him do. When they sighted the Republican River, Gus was with him. From a distance, it didn't seem like much of a river. "That's the one that got the Pumphrey boy, ain't it?" Augustus said. "Hope it don't get none of us. We're a skinny outfit as it is." "We wouldn't be if you did any work," Call said. "Are you going to leave her in Oglala, or what?" "Are you talking about Laurie or this mare I'm riding?" Augustus asked. "If it's Laurie, it wouldn't kill you to use her name." "I don't see that it matters," Call said, though even as he said it, he remembered that it had seemed to matter to Maggie. She had wanted to hear him say her name. "You've got a name," Augustus said. "Don't it matter to you whether people use it?" "Not much," Call said. "No, I guess it wouldn't," Augustus said. "You're so sure you're right, it doesn't matter to you whether people talk to you at all. I'm glad I've been wrong enough to keep in practice." "Why would you want to keep in practice being wrong?" Call asked. "I'd think it would be something you'd try to avoid." "You can't avoid it. You've got to learn to handle it," Augustus said. "If you only come face to face with your own mistakes once or twice in your life, it's bound to be extra painful. I face mine every day. That way they ain't usually much worse than a dry shave." "Anyway, I hope you leave her," Call said. "We might get in the Indians before we get to Montana." "I'll have to see," Augustus said. "We've grown attached. I won't leave her unless I'm sure she's in good hands." "Are you aiming to marry?" "I could do worse," Augustus said. "I've done worse twice, in fact. However, matrimony's a big step, and we ain't discussed it." "Of course you ain't seen the other one yet," Call said. "That one's got a name, too. Clara," Augustus pointed out. "You are determined not to use names for females. I'm surprised you even named your mare." "P.I. named her," Call said. It was true. P.I. had done it the first time she bit him. That afternoon they swam the Republican without losing an animal. At supper afterward, Jasper Fant's spirits were high. He had built up an unreasoning fear of the Republican River, and felt that once he crossed it, he could count on living practically forever. He felt so good he even danced an impromptu jig. "You've missed your calling, Jasper," Augustus said, highly amused by this display. "You ought to try dancing in whorehouses. You might pick up a favor or two that you otherwise couldn't afford." "Reckon the captain will let us go to town once we get to Nebraska?" Needle asked. "It seems like a long time since there's been a town." "If you don't, I think I'll marry a heifer," Bert said. Pocampo sat with his back against a wagon wheel, jingling his tambourine. "It's going to get dry," he said. "Fine," Soupy replied. "I got wet enough down about the red to last me forever." "It's better to be wet than dry," Pocampo said. Usually cheerful, he had fallen into a somber mood. "It ain't if you drown," P.I. observed. "There won't be much to cook when it gets dry," Po said. Newt and the Rainey boys had begun to talk of whores. Surely the captain would let them go to town with the rest of the crew when they hit Oglala. The puzzling thing was how much a whore might cost. The talk around the wagon was never very specific on that score. The Rainey boys were constantly tallying up their wages and trying to calculate whether they would be sufficient. What made it complicated was that they had played cards for credit the whole way north. The older hands had done the same, and the debts were complicated. As the arrival in Oglala began to dominate their thoughts almost entirely, the question of cash was constantly discussed, and many debts discounted on the promise of actual money. "What if they don't pay us here?" the pessimistic Needle asked one night. We signed on for Montana. We might not get no wages in Nebraska." "Oh, the captain will pay us," Dish said. Despite his attachment to Lorena, he was becoming as excited as the rest about going to town. "Why would he?" Lippy asked. "He don't care whether you have a whore or not, Dish." That sentiment struck everyone as almost undoubtedly true and established a general worry. By the time they crossed the stinking water, the worry had become so oppressive that many hands could think of nothing else. Finally, a delegation headed by Jasper approached Augustus on the subject. They surrounded him one morning when he came for breakfast and expressed their fear. Augustus had a big laugh when he figured out what was bothering them. "Why, you girls," he said, "all you want is orgies." "No, it's whores we want," Jasper said, a little irritated. "It's fine for you to laugh. You got Laurie." "Yes, but what's good for me ain't necessarily good for the weak-minded," Augustus said. However, the next day he passed the word that everyone would be paid half wages in Oglala. Call was not enthusiastic, but the men had worked well, and he couldn't oppose giving them a day in town. As soon as they heard the ruling, spirits improved, all except Pocampos. He continued to insist that it would be dry. Chapter 80. When Elmira's fever finally broke, she was so weak she could barely turn her head on the pillow. The first thing she saw was Zwei looking in the window of the doctor's little house. It was raining, but Zwei stood there in his buffalo coat looking in at her. The next day he was still there, and the next. She wanted to call out to him to see if he had news of Dee, but she was too weak. Her voice was just a whisper. The doctor who tended her, a short man with a red beard, seemed not much healthier than she was. He coughed so hard that sometimes he would have to set her medicine down to keep from spilling it. His name was Patrick Arundel, and his hands shook after each coughing fit. But he had taken her in and tended her almost constantly for the first week, expecting all the time that she would die. "He's as loyal as any dog," he whispered to her when she was well enough to understand conversation. For a while she had just stared back at him without comprehension when he spoke to her. He meant Zwei, of course. "I couldn't even get the man to go away and eat," the doctor told her. "I live on tea myself, but he's a big man. Tea won't keep him going. I guess he asked me 1,000 times if you were going to live." The doctor sat in a little thin-framed chair by her bed and gave her medicine by the spoonful. "It's to build you up," he said. "You didn't hardly have no blood in you when you got here." Elmira wished there was a window shade so she couldn't see Zwei staring at her. He stared for hours. She could feel his eyes on her, but she was too weak to turn her head away. Luke seemed to be gone. At least he never showed up. "Where's Dee?" she whispered when her voice came back a little. The doctor didn't hear her, she said it so faint, but he happened to notice her lips move. She had to say it again. "Dee Boot," she whispered. "Oh, did you follow that story?" the doctor said. "Hung him right on schedule about a week after they brought you in. Buried him in Boot Hill. It's a good joke on him, since his name was Boot. He killed a 9-year-old boy. He won't be missed around here." Elmira shut her eyes, hoping she could be dead. From then on, she spat out her medicine, letting it dribble onto the gown the doctor had given her. He didn't understand at first. "Sick to your stomach?" he said. "That's natural. We'll try soup." He tried soup, and she spat that out, too, for a day, but she was too weak to fight the doctor, who was almost as patient as Zwei. They kept her jailed with their patience when all she wanted to do was die. Dee was gone, after she had come such a way and found him. She hated Zwei and Luke for bringing her to the doctor. Surely she would have died right on the street if they hadn't. The last thing she wanted to do was get well and have to live. But days passed, and the doctor sat in the little chair feeding her soup, and Zwei stared in the window even though she wouldn't look. Even not looking, she could smell Zwei. It was hot summer, and the doctor left the window open all day. She could hear horses going by on the street, and smell Zwei standing there only a few feet from her. Flies bothered her. The doctor asked if she wanted Zwei to come in, for he would be only too happy to sit and shoo the flies, but Elmira didn't answer. If Dee was dead, she was through with talk. It occurred to her one night that she could ask Zwei to shoot her. He would give her a gun, of course, but she didn't think she had the strength to pull the trigger. Better to ask him to shoot her. That would solve it, and they wouldn't do so much to Zwei if he told them he killed her at her own request. Just thinking of such a simple solution seemed to ease her mind a bit. She could have Zwei shoot her. And yet days passed, and she got so she could sit up in bed, and she didn't do it. Her mind kept going back to the spot of sunlight where Dee's face had vanished. His face had just faded into the sunlight. She couldn't stop thinking of it. In dreams, she would see it so clearly that she would wake up to the sound of Zwei's snoring. He slept outside her window with his back to the wall of the house. His snores were so loud a person might have thought a bull was sleeping there. "What went with Luke?" she asked him one day. "Went to Santa Fe," Zwei said. It had been a month since she had spoken to him. He thought probably she never would again. "Hired on with some traders," he said. "Come all this way, and then headed back." "I guess your child didn't live," the doctor said one day. "I wouldn't have expected it to, out on the prairie, with you having such a close call." Elmira didn't answer. She remembered her breasts hurting, that was all. She had forgotten the child, the woman with the 2 daughters, the big house. Maybe the baby was dead. Then she remembered July and Arkansas, and a lot that she had forgotten. It was just as well forgotten. None of it mattered compared to Dee. It was all past, well past. Some day she would have Zwei shoot her, and she wouldn't have to think about things any more. But she put it off, and in time got well enough to walk. She didn't go far, just to the door, to get a chamber pot or put one out of the room. The heat made the smells worse. Even Zwei had finally taken off his buffalo coat. He stood at the window in an old shirt with holes worn in it so that the thick hairs of his chest poked through. The doctor never asked her about money. Though she had gotten better, he hadn't. She could hear him coughing through the wall, and sometimes saw him spit into a handkerchief. His hands trembled badly, and he always smelled of whiskey. It troubled her that he didn't ask her for money. She had always been one to pay her way. Finally, she mentioned it. She knew Zwei would go to work and get money for her if she asked him to. "You'll have to let me know what I owe," she said, but Patrick O'Randall just shook his head. "I came here to get away from money," he said. "Did it, too. I got away from it, and it ain't easy to get away from money." Elmira didn't mention it again. If he wanted to be paid, he could mention it. She had tried. Then one day, with no warning from anyone, the door to her room opened, and July walked in. Zwei was standing at the window when it happened. July's face seemed thinner. "I found you, Ellie," he said, and there were tears in his eyes. Zwei was watching, but because of the shadows, she didn't know if he could see that July was crying. Elmira looked away. She didn't know what to do. Mainly, she regretted that she had not had Zwei shoot her. Now July had found her. He had not come all the way in the room, but he was standing there with the door half open, waiting for her to ask him in. She didn't ask him in, didn't speak. It seemed she would always have bad luck if he could come all that way across the plains and still find her. Finally, July came in the room and closed the door. "The doctor says you're strong enough to talk," July said, wiping his eyes on his shirt sleeve. "You don't have to talk, though. You just lie there and get well. I won't stay very long. I just wanted you to know I came." Elmira looked at him once and then looked at the wall. "Well, you're a fool," she thought. "You ought not to have followed. You ought to just told folks I was dead." "I got one piece of bad news," July said, and his eyes filled up again. "It's real bad, and it's my fault. Joe got killed. Him and Roscoe and a girl. An outlaw killed them. I ought to have stayed with them, but I don't know if it would have come out different if I had." You wouldn't be here telling me anyway, Elmira thought. The news about Joe didn't touch her. She had never thought much about Joe. He had come when she had other things to worry about. and she had never got in the habit of worrying about him. He gave her less trouble than July, though. At least he had sense enough to figure out she didn't want to be bothered with him, and had let her alone. If he was dead, that was that. She didn't remember him well. He hadn't talked much. He had just run out of luck on the plains. It might have happened to her, and she wished it had. "Ellie, the baby's fine," July said. "I didn't even know it was ours. That's the funny thing. I seen Clara holding it, and I had no notion it was ours. She named him Martin, if that's all right with you." "I guess we got our own family now," July added. His heart was sinking so that his voice almost failed, for Ellie had not turned her head or given much more than a momentary sign of recognition. She hadn't spoken. He wanted to think it was just her weakness, but he knew it was more than that. She wasn't happy that he had found her. She didn't care about the baby, didn't even care that Joe was dead. Her face had not changed expression since the first look of surprise. And all the while, the large man with the holes in his shirt stood at the window silently, looking in. He was one of the buffalo hunters, July supposed. The doctor had spoken well of the man, mentioning how loyal he was to Elmira. But July didn't understand why he was standing there, and his heart was sinking because Ellie wouldn't look at him. He had come such a way, too, but she wouldn't, and he didn't think it was just because she was sick. "We'll bring the baby in whenever you want it," July said. "I can rent a room till you're better. He's a strong baby. Clara says it won't hurt him a bit to come in. They've got a little wagon." Elmira waited. If she didn't talk, sooner or later he would leave. His voice was shaky. He sat down in the chair the doctor usually sat in by the bedside. After a moment he took one of her hands. Zwei was still looking in. July only held her hand for a moment. He dropped it and stood up. "I'll check every few days, Ellie," he said. "The doctor can send for me if you need me." He paused. In the face of her silence, he didn't know what to say. She sat propped up against the pillow, silent. It was almost as if she were dead. It reminded him of times in Arkansas, times in the loft when he felt as if he were with someone who wasn't there. When he had found out she was alive and at the doctor's in Oglala, he had gone off behind Clara's saddle shed and wept for an hour from relief. After all the worry and doubt, he had found her. But now, in a minute, the relief was gone, and he was reminded of all her difficulties, how nothing he did pleased her, not even finding her in Oglala. He didn't know what more to do or say. She had married him and carried his child, and yet she wouldn't turn her head to look at him. Maybe it's too soon, he thought, as he stumbled in a daze of pain and worry out of the doctor's house. The big man was there watching. "I'm much obliged for all the help you've given Ellie," he said. "I'll pay you back for any expense." Zwei said nothing, and July walked away to get his horse. Ellie saw him ride past the window. She got up and watched him until he was out of sight. Zwei stood watching, too. "Zwei," Elmira said, "get the wagon. I want to go." Zwei was surprised. He had got used to her being in the bed in the doctor's house. He liked standing in the warm sun watching her. She was so pretty in the bed. "Ain't you sick?" he asked. "No, get the wagon," she said. "I want to go today." "Go which way?" he asked. "Go," Elmira said. "Go away from here. I don't care where. Over to St. Louis will do." "I don't know the way to St. Louis," Zwei said. "Oh, get the wagon. We'll find the way," she said. "There's a road, I guess." She was out of patience with men. They were great ones for asking questions. Even Zwei asked them, and he could barely talk. Zwei did as he was told. The doctor was gone, treating a farmer who had broken his hip. Elmira thought about leaving him a note, but didn't. The doctor was smart. He would figure out soon enough that she was gone. And before the sun set, they left Oglala, going east. Elmira rode in the wagon on a buffalo skin. Zwei drove. His horse was hitched to the rear of the wagon. She had asked him to take her, which made him proud. Luke had tried to confuse him, but now Luke was gone, and the man who came to see Elmira had been left behind. She had asked him to take her, not the other man. It must mean that they were married, just as he had hoped. She didn't say much to him, but she had asked him to take her, and that knowledge made him feel happy. He would take her anywhere she asked. The only troublesome thought he had was the result of something the man at the livery stable said. He had been a dried-up little fellow, smaller than Luke. He had asked which way they were going, and Zwei pointed east. He knew St. Louis was east. "You might as well leave your scalps, then," the man said. "Have 'em sent by mail once you get there." "Why?" Zwei asked, puzzled. He had never heard of anyone sending a scalp in the mail. "Because of the Sioux," the man said. "We never saw no Indians the whole way from Texas," Zwei remarked. "You might not see the Sioux either," the man said, "but they'll see you. You're a damn fool to take a woman east of here." Zwei mentioned it to Elmira while he was helping her into the wagon. "There might be Indians that way," he said. "I don't care," Elmira said. "Let's go." Many nights on the trail from Texas she had lain awake in terror of Indians. They saw none, but the fear stayed with her all the way to Nebraska. She had heard too many stories. Now she didn't care. The sickness had changed her, that and the death of Dee. She had lost the fear. A few miles from town they stopped and camped. She lay awake in the wagon much of the night. Zwei slept on the ground, snoring, his rifle held tightly in his big hands. She wasn't sleepy, but she wasn't afraid either. It was cloudy, and the plains were very dark. Anything could come out of the darkness, Indians, bandits, snakes. The doctor had claimed there were panthers. All she heard was the wind rustling the grass. Her only worry was that July might follow. He had followed all the way from Texas. He might follow again. Maybe Zwei would kill him if he followed. It was peculiar that she disliked July so, but she did. If he didn't leave her alone, she would have Zwei kill him. Zwei woke early. The man at the livery stable had worried him. He had been in 3 Indian fights, but both times he had several men with him. Now it was just he who would have to do all the fighting if it came to that. He wished Luke hadn't been so quick to rush off to Santa Fe. Luke didn't always behave right, but he was a good shot. The livery stable man acted as if they were as good as dead. It was morning, and they weren't dead, but Zwei felt worried. He felt perhaps he had not explained things well to Ellie. "It's them Oglala Sioux," he said, looking in the wagon at her. It was a warm morning, and she had thrown off the blankets. "He said the army had them all stirred up," he added. "I'll stir you up if you don't quit blabbing to me about Indians," Elmira said. "I told you yesterday I want to get gone a good ways before July shows up in town again." Her eyes flashed when she spoke, as they had before she got sick. Ashamed to have angered her, Zwei began to stir the fire under the coffee pot. Chapter 81. When July came back from town, he was so depressed he couldn't speak. Clara had asked him to do a few errands, but the visit with Elmira troubled him so that he had forgotten them. Even after he got back to the ranch, he didn't remember that he had been asked to do anything. Clara saw at once that he had sustained some blow. When she saw him come back without even the mail, it had been on her tongue to say something about his poor memory. She and the girls hungered for the magazines and catalogs that came in the mail, and it was a disappointment to have someone ride right past the post office and not pick them up. But July looked so low that she refrained from speaking. At the supper table she tried several times to get a word or two out of him, but he just sat there, scarcely even touching his food. He had been ravenous since coming off the plains, so whatever the blow was, it was serious. She knew he was a man who was grateful for any kindness. She had shown him several, and she showed him another by holding her tongue and giving him time to get past whatever had happened in town. But there was something about his silent, sunken manner that irritated her. "Everything's gloomy," Betsy said. Betsy was quick to pick up moods. "Yep," Clara said. She was holding the baby, who was babbling and gumming his fist. "It's a good thing we got Martin here," she said. "He's the only man we got who can still talk." "He don't talk," Sally said. "That ain't talk." "Well, it's sound, at least," Clara said. "I think you're mean," Sally said. She was quick to attack mother and sister alike. "Daddy's sick, or he'd talk." "All right," Clara said, "I'll take that back." In fact, she could remember 1,000 meals when Bob hadn't said a word. "I think you're mean," Sally repeated, not satisfied. "Yes, and you're my equal," Clara said, looking at her daughter. July realized it all had something to do with him, but he couldn't get his mind on it. He carried his plate to the sink and thanked Clara for the meal. Then he went out on the front porch, glad it was a dark night. He felt he would cry. It was puzzling. He didn't know what to do. He had never heard of a wife doing any of the things Elmira had done. He sat on the steps of the porch, sadder and more bewildered than he had been even on the night when he got back to the river and discovered the 3 bodies. There was nothing to do about death, but Elmira was alive. He had to do something, he just didn't know what. The girls came out and chattered behind him for a while, but he paid them no mind. He had a headache and thought he ought to lie down, except that lying down usually made his headaches worse. Clara came out, still holding the baby, and sat in a rocker. "You seem to be feeling poorly, Mr. Johnson," she said. "Just call me July," he said. "I'll be happy to," she said. "You can drop the missus, too. I think we know one another well enough for first names now." July didn't think he knew her very well, but he didn't say it. He didn't think he knew any woman. "I need to ask you a favor," she said. "Could you help me turn my husband? Or are you feeling too poorly?" He would help her, of course. Several times he had helped her with her husband. The man had lost so much weight that July could simply lift him while Clara changed the bedding. The first time it bothered him a good deal, for the man never closed his eyes. That night he worried about what the man might think. Another man coming in with his wife. Clara was businesslike about it, telling him what to do when he was slow. July wondered if the man was listening, and what he was thinking, in case he was. Clara handed him a lantern, and they went inside. She left the baby with the girls for a minute. Clara stopped at the door of her bedroom and listened before going in. "Every time I come, I expect he'll have stopped breathing," she said. "I always stop and listen." The man was breathing, though. July lifted him, and Clara removed the sheets. "Darn it, I forgot the water," she said, going to the door. "Sally, bring up the bucket," she yelled, and in a little while the girl appeared with it. "Betsy's going to let the baby fall off the bed," she said. "She don't know how to hold it." "Well, she better learn," Clara said. "You girls quit fighting over that baby." July felt embarrassed, holding the sick, naked man while his wife sponged him with warm water. It seemed very improper to him. Clara seemed to understand how he felt and made the bed quickly. "It's just nurse work, Mr. Johnson," she said. "I tried keeping clothes on him, but it's no good. The poor man can't control himself." She stopped and looked at him. "I forgot I was supposed to call you July," she said. July felt that his head would burst. He didn't care what she called him. It hurt so that he could hardly walk straight on the stairs. He bumped into the door at the foot of the stairs. Above them, the baby was squalling. Clara was about to go and see to the baby, but when she saw July stumble into the door, she changed her mind. He went back out on the porch and sank on the steps, as if at the end of his strength. Clara reached down and put her palm against his forehead, which caused him to jump as if he had been struck. "My goodness, you're shy as a colt," she said. "I thought you might be feverish, but you ain't." "It's just my head," he said. "You need a cool rag, then," she said. She went back into the house and got a rag and a little water. She made him let her bathe his forehead and temples. He had to admit the cool water felt good. "Thank you," he said. "Oh, you don't have to thank me for a wash rag," Clara said. "I'm not much of a nurse. It's one of my failings. I'm too impatient. I'll give a person a week or two, and then if they don't improve, I'd just about as soon they'd die. Not children," she added a little later. "I ain't that harsh with children. I'd rather have them sick 5 years than to lose one. It's just my observation that nursing don't do that much good. People get well if they're able, or else they die." They were silent for several minutes. "Did you find your wife?" Clara asked. "It ain't my business, I know, but I'll ask you anyway." "Yes," July said. "She was at the doctor's." "She must not have been very glad to see you," Clara said. July wished she would leave him alone. She had taken him in and fed him, saved his wife and cared for his child, and yet he did wish she would just leave him alone. He felt so weak himself that if he hadn't been braced against the porch railing, he might have rolled off the steps. He had nothing to say and nothing to offer, and yet there was something tireless in Clara that never seemed to stop. His head hurt so he felt like shooting himself. The baby was squalling overhead, and yet she would ask questions. "I guess she's still sick," he said. "She didn't say much." "Did she want the baby?" "She didn't say," July said. "Did she ask any questions about it at all?" "No," July admitted. "She never said a word." The baby had stopped crying. They heard a horse splash out of the river. Cholo was coming in late. Even with no moon, they could see his white hair as he trotted to the corrals. "July, I know you're tired," Clara said. "I expect you're heartsick. I'm going to say a terrible thing to you. I used to be ladylike, but Nebraska's made me blunt. I don't think that woman wants you or the baby either. I don't know what she does want, but she left that baby without even looking at it." "She must have been addled," July said. "She had a hard trip." Clara sighed. "She had a hard trip, but she wasn't addled," she said. "Not every woman wants every child, and plenty of wives don't want the husbands they took. It's your child and her child," she added, "but I don't think she wants it. And if she means to prove me wrong, she better do it soon." July didn't know what she meant and didn't really care. He felt too low to pay any attention. "I like young things," Clara said. "Babies and young horses. I get attached real quick. They don't have to be mine." She paused. She knew he wished she'd shut up, but she was determined to say what was on her mind. "I'm getting attached to Martin," she said. "He ain't mine, but he ain't your wife's any more either. Young things mainly belong to themselves. How they grow up depends on who gets attached to them. I'll take Martin if she don't, or you don't." "But your husband's sick," July said. "Why would the woman want a baby to care for when she had 2 girls to manage and a big horse outfit to run?" "My husband's dying," Clara said, "but whether he's dead or alive, I'll still raise the child." "I don't know what to do," July said. "It's been so long since I've done anything right that I can't remember it. I don't know if I'll ever get Ellie back to Fort Smith. They might even have hired a new sheriff by now." "Finding a job's the least of your problems," Clara said. "I'll give you a job if you want one. Cholo's been doing Bob's work, and his too, and he can't keep it up forever." "I always lived in Arkansas," July said. It had never occurred to him that he might settle anywhere else. Clara laughed. "Go to bed," she said. "I've worried you enough for one night." He went, but the next morning at breakfast he didn't look much better or feel much better. He would scarcely talk to the girls, both of whom doted on him. Clara sent them off to gather eggs, so she could have a word or 2 more with July in private. "Did you understand what I said last night about raising Martin?" she asked. July hadn't. He wished she would just be quiet. He had no idea what to do next, and hadn't since he left Fort Smith many months ago. At moments, what he wanted was just to go home. Let Ellie go if she didn't want to be his wife. Let Clara have the baby if she wanted him so much. He had once felt competent being a sheriff. Maybe if he went back and stuck to it, he would someday feel competent again. He didn't know how much longer he could stand to feel such a failure. "If your wife don't want Martin, do you have a mother or sisters that would want to raise him?" Clara asked. "The point is, I don't want to keep him a year or 2 and then give him up. If I have to give him up, I'd rather do it soon." "No, Ma's dead," July said. "I just had brothers." "I've lost 3 boys," Clara said. "I don't want to lose another to a woman who keeps changing her mind." "I'll ask her," July said. "I'll go back in a day or 2. Maybe she'll be feeling better." But he found he couldn't stand it to wait. He had to see her again, even if she wouldn't look at him. At least he could look at her and know he had found her after all. Maybe, if he was patient, she would change. He saddled and rode to town, but when he got to the doctor's, no one was there at all. The room Ellie had been in was empty, the big man no longer to be found. By asking around, he found the doctor, who was delivering a baby in one of the whorehouses. "She's left," the doctor said. "I came home yesterday and she was gone. She didn't leave a note." "But she was sick," July said. "Only unhappy," Patrick O'Randall said. He felt sorry for the young man. 5 idle young whores were listening to the conversation while one of their friends lay in labor in the next room. "She took it hard when they hung that killer," he added. "That and the childbirth nearly killed her. I thought she would die. She ran one of the highest fevers I've ever seen. It's a good sign that she left. It means she's decided to live a little longer." The man at the livery stable shook his head when July asked which way they went. "The wrong way," he said. "If they get past them Sioux, they're lucky people." July felt frantic. He had not even brought his rifle to town, or his bedroll or anything. They had a day's start, though they were traveling in a wagon and would have to move slow. Still, he would lose another half-day going back to the ranch to get his gear. He was tempted to follow with just his pistol, and he even rode to the east end of town. But there were the vast, endless plains. They had almost swallowed him once. He turned back, racing for the ranch. He wore the horse half down, and he remembered it was a borrowed horse, so he slowed up. By the time he got back to Clara's, he was not racing at all. He seemed to have no strength, and his head hurt again. He was barely able to unsaddle. Instead of going right to the house, he sat down behind the saddle shed and wept. Why would Ellie keep leaving? What was he supposed to do? Didn't she know about the Indians? It seemed he would have to chase her forever, and yet catching her did no good. When he stood up, he saw Clara. She had been on her way back from the garden with a basket of vegetables. It was hot, and she had rolled the sleeves up on her dress. Her arms were thin and yet strong, as if they were all bone. "Did she leave?" Clara asked. July nodded. He didn't want to talk. "Come help me shuck this corn," Clara said. "The roasting ears are about gone. I get so hungry for them during the winter I could eat a dozen." She went on toward the house, carrying her heavy garden basket. When she didn't hear his footsteps, she looked back at him. July wiped his face and followed her to the house. Chapter 82. The next morning, when he managed to get up, July came into the kitchen to find Cholo sharpening a thin-bladed knife. The baby lay on the table, kicking his bare feet, and Clara, wearing a man's hat, was giving the 2 girls instructions. "Don't feed him just because he hollers," she said. "Feed him when it's time." She looked at July, who felt embarrassed. He was not sick, and yet he felt as weak as if he had had a long fever. A plate with some cold eggs on it and a bit of bacon sat on the table, his breakfast, no doubt. Being the last one up made him feel a burden. Cholo stood up. It was clear he and Clara were contemplating some work. July knew he ought to offer to help, but his legs would barely carry him to the table. He couldn't understand it. He had long since been over his jaundice, and yet he had no strength. "We've got to geld some horses," Clara said. "We've put it off too long, hoping Bob would get back on his feet." "I hate it when you do that," Sally said. "You'd hate it worse if we had a bunch of studs running around here," Clara said. "One of them might crack your head just like that Mustang cracked your father's." She paused by the table a minute and tickled one of the baby's feet. "I'd like to help," July said. "You don't look that vigorous," she said. "I'm not sick," July said. "I must have slept too hard." "I expect you did something too hard," she said. "Stay and make conversation with these girls. That's harder work than gelding horses." July liked the girls, though he had not said much to them. They seemed fine girls to him, always chattering. Mostly they fought over who got to tend the baby. Clara and Cholo left, and July slowly ate his breakfast, feeling guilty. Then he remembered what had happened. Ellie was gone, into Indian country. He had to go after her as soon as he ate. The baby, still on the table, gurgled at him. July had scarcely looked at it, though it seemed a good baby. Clara wanted it, the girls fought over it, and yet Ellie had left it. Thinking about it made him more confused. After breakfast he got his rifle, but instead of leaving, he walked down to the lots. Every now and then he heard the squeal of a young horse. Walking, he didn't feel quite so weak, and it occurred to him that he ought to try and be some help. He could start after Ellie later. It was hot, and the young horses were kicking up dust in the lots. To his surprise, he saw that Clara was doing the cutting while the old man held the ropes. It was hard work, the horses were strong, and they badly needed another man. July quickly climbed into the lots and helped the old man anchor the hind legs of a quivering young bay. Clara paused a moment, wiping the sweat off her forehead with her shirt-tail. Her hands were bloody. "Shouldn't one of us do it?" July asked. "No," Cholo said. "She is better." "Bob taught me," Clara said. "We didn't have any help when we first came here. I wasn't strong enough to hold the horses, so I got stuck with the messier job." They gelded 15 young horses and left them in the pen where they could be watched. July had stopped feeling weak, but even so it was a wonder to him how hard Clara and the old man worked. They didn't stop to rest until the job was done, by which time they were all soaked with sweat. Clara splashed water out of the horse trough to wash her hands and forearms, and immediately started for the house. "I hope those worthless girls have been cooking," she said. "I've built an appetite." "Do you know anything about the Indian situation?" July asked. "I know Red Cloud," Clara said. "Bob was good to him. They lived on our horses that hard winter we had 4 years ago. They couldn't find buffalo." "I've heard they're dangerous," July said. "Yes," Clara said. "Red Cloud's fed up. Bob treated them fair, and we've never had to fear them. I was more scared as a girl. The Comanches would come right into Austin and take children. I always dreamed they'd get me, and I'd have red babies." July had never felt so irresolute. He ought to go, and yet he didn't. Though he had worked hard, he had little appetite, and after the meal spent more time cleaning his gun than was really necessary. When he finished, he sat the rifle against the porch railing, telling himself that he would get up and leave. But before he could get up, Clara walked out on the porch with no warning at all, and put the baby into his hands. She practically dropped the child into his lap, an act July felt was very reckless. He had to catch him. "That's a good sign," Clara said. "At least you'd catch him if somebody threw him off a roof." The baby stared at July with wide eyes, as surprised evidently as he was. July looked at Clara, who seemed angry. "I think it's time you took a look at him," she said. "He's your boy. He might come to like you, in which case he'll bring you more happiness than that woman ever will. He needs you a sight more than she does, too." July felt scared he would do something wrong with the baby. He also was a little scared of Clara. "I don't know anything about babies," he said. "No, and you've never lived any place but Arkansas," Clara said. "But you ain't stupid, and you ain't nailed down. You can live other places, and you can learn about children. People dumber than you learn about them." Again, July felt belabored by the tireless thing in Clara. Ellie might not look at him, but she didn't pursue him relentlessly with words as Clara did. "Stay here," she said. "Do you hear me? Stay here. Martin needs a paw, and I could use a good hand. If you go trailing after that woman, either the Indians will kill you or that buffalo hunter will, or you'll just get lost and starve. It's a miracle you made it this far. You don't know the plains, and I don't believe you know your wife either. How long did you know her before you were married?" July tried to remember. The trial in Missouri had lasted 3 days, but he had met Ellie nearly a week before that. 2 weeks, I guess, he said. "That's short acquaintance," Clara said. "The smartest man alive can't learn much about a woman in 2 weeks." Well, she wanted to marry, July said. It was all he could remember about it. Ellie had made it clear she wanted to marry. That could have been another way of saying she wanted a change of scene, Clara said. People get a hankering to quit what they're doing. They think they want to try something else. I do it myself. Half the time, I think I'd like to pack up these girls and go live with my aunt in Richmond, Virginia. What would you do there? July asked. I might write books, Clara said. I've a hankering to try it. But then it'll come a pretty morning, and I see the horses grazing and think how I'd miss them. So I doubt I'll get off to Richmond. Just then the baby began to cry, squirming in his hands. July looked at Clara, but she made no effort to take the baby. July didn't know what to do. He was afraid he might drop the child, who twisted in his hands like a rabbit and yelled so loud he turned red as a beet. Is he sick? July asked. No, he's fine, Clara said. Maybe he's telling you off for ignoring him all this time. I wouldn't blame him. With that she turned and went back in the house, leaving him with the baby, who at once began to cry even harder. July hoped one of the girls would come out and help, but neither seemed to be around. It seemed very irresponsible of Clara to simply leave him with the child. He felt again that she was not a very helpful woman, but then Ellie hadn't been helpful either. He was afraid to stand up with the baby squirming so he might drop him. So he sat, wondering why in the world people wanted children. How could anyone know what a baby wanted or what to do for them? But as abruptly as he had started, the baby stopped crying. He whimpered a time or two, stuck his fist in his mouth, and then simply stared at July again, as he had at first. July was so relieved that he scarcely moved. "Talk to him a little," Clara said. She stood in the door behind him. "What do you say?" She made a snort of disgust. "Introduce yourself if you can't think of nothing else," she said, "or sing him a song. He's sociable. He likes a little talk." July looked at the baby but couldn't think of a song. "Can't you even hum?" Clara asked, as if it were a crime that he had not immediately started singing. July remembered a saloon song he had always liked, Lorena. He tried humming a little of it. The baby, who had been wiggling, stopped at once and looked at him solemnly. July felt silly humming, but since it calmed the baby, he kept on. He was holding the baby almost at arm's length. "Put him against your shoulder," Clara said. "You don't have to hold him like that. He ain't a newspaper." July tried it. The baby soon wet his shirt with slobbers, but he wasn't crying. July continued to hum Lorena. Then, to his relief, Clara took the baby. "That's progress," she said. "Rome wasn't built in a day." Dusk came, and July didn't leave. He sat on the porch, his rifle across his lap, trying to make up his mind to go. He knew he ought to. However difficult she was, Ellie was still his wife. She might be in danger, and it was his duty to try and save her. If he didn't go, he would be giving up forever. He might never even know if she had lived or died. He didn't want to be the kind of man who would just let his wife blow out of his life like a weed. And yet that was what he was doing. He felt too tired to do otherwise. Even if the Indians didn't get him or them, even if he didn't get lost on the plains, he might just find her in some other room, her turn her face away again. Then what? She could go on running, and he would go on chasing until something really bad happened. When Clara came out again to call him to supper, he felt worn out from thinking. He almost flinched when he heard Clara's step, for he had a feeling she was ill-disposed toward him and might have something sharp to say. Again, he was wrong. She walked down the steps and paused to watch 3 cranes flying across the sunset along the silver path of the Platte. "Ain't they great birds?" she said quietly. "I wonder which I'd miss most, them or the horses, if I was to move away." July didn't suppose she would move away. She seemed so much of the place that it didn't seem likely. After watching the birds, she looked at him as if just noticing that he was still there. "Are you willing to stay?" she asked. July had rather she hadn't asked. Rather it had been something that just happened. He didn't feel he had made a decision, and yet he hadn't left. "I guess I oughtn't to chase her," he said finally. "I guess I ought to let her be." "It doesn't do to sacrifice for people unless they want you to," Clara said. "It's just a waste." "Ma, it's getting cold," Betsy said from the doorway. "I was just enjoying the summer for a minute," Clara said. "Well, you're always telling us how much you hate to serve cold food," Betsy said. Clara looked at her daughter for a moment, and then went up to the steps. "Come on, July," she said. "These girls mean to see that we keep up our standards." He put the rifle back in the saddle scabbard and followed her into the house. Chapter 83. As the herd wound across the brown prairies toward the Platte, whoring became the only thing the men could talk about. Of course, they always liked to talk about it, but there had been sections of the drive when they occasionally mentioned other things: the weather, cards, the personalities of horses, trials and tribulations of the past. After Jake's death, they had talked a good deal about the vagaries of justice and what might cause a pleasant man to go bad. Once in a while, they might talk about their families, although that usually ended with everyone getting homesick. Though a popular subject, it was tricky to handle. By the time they were within a week of Oglala, all subjects other than whoring were judged to be superfluous. Newt and the Rainey boys were rather surprised. They were interested in whoring, too. By the time they were within a week of Oglala, all subjects other than whoring were judged to be superfluous. Newt and the Rainey boys were rather surprised. They were interested in whoring, too, in a vague sort of way, but listening to the grown men talk at night, or during almost any stop, they concluded there must be more to whoring than they had imagined. Getting to visit a whore quickly came to seem the most exciting prospect life had to offer. "What if the captain don't even want to stop in Oglala?" Lippy asked one night. "He ain't much of a stopper." "Nobody's asking him to stop," Needle said. "He can keep driving if he's a mind. We're the ones need to stop." "I don't guess he likes whores," Lippy said. "He didn't come in the saloon much, that I remember." Jasper was impatient with Lippy's pessimism. Any suggestion that they might not get to visit Oglala was extremely upsetting to him. "Can't you shut up?" he said. "We don't care what the captain does. We just want to be let off." Po Campo was also likely to dampen the discussion once he was free from his cooking chores. "I think you should all go to the barber and forget these whores," he added. "They will just take your money. And what will you get for it?" "Something nice," Needle said. "A haircut will last you a month, but what you get from the whores will only last a moment," Po remarked, "unless she gives you something you don't want." From the heated responses that ensued, Newt gathered that whores sometimes were not simply givers of pleasure. Diseases apparently sometimes resulted, although no one was very specific about them.